Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The forest was silent except for the rustle of vines and the slow drip of latex into woven baskets. A group of exhausted villagers emerged from the shadows, their arms trembling under the weight of wild rubber, while nearby a soldier counted severed hands with mechanical calm, one hand for each bullet fired, one hand for each life broken. No speeches, no outrage, just routine violence in a place where human suffering had become a measurement of profit. It was the Congo at the dawn of Leopold's rule, where survival itself was an act of defiance. Thousands of miles away in Brussels, European elites toasted crystal glasses beneath chandeliers, praising King Leopold II as a visionary philanthropist bringing civilization to Africa. Newspapers called him a humanitarian, reformer, even a crusader against slavery, and portraits presented him as a benevolent monarch guiding a backward land toward progress. The gulf between image and reality was vast, one world drenched in blood, the other in polite applause. And no one in those glittering halls seemed eager to ask what price was being paid. The central question of this story emerges from that contradiction. How did a European king, ruling a tiny nation, manage to turn an African territory the size of Western Europe into his personal killing ground? And perhaps even more disturbingly, how did the world allow it to continue for more than 2 decades? Between 1885 and 1908, the Congo Free State became one of the deadliest colonial projects in history, a place where human beings were treated as raw material and violence functioned like an industry. The death toll remains debated. Some scholars estimate 1 to 2 million lives lost. Others argue figures closer to 10 million, but all agree on the scale of catastrophe. What unfolded in the Congo was more than exploitation. It was a system built on dehumanization, fear, and the relentless pursuit of wealth. Entire communities were uprooted, families torn apart, children forced into labor, and villages erased from the map as if they had never existed. Every river, every trail, every outpost carried traces of suffering that rarely reached European ears. The horror was widespread, systematic, and disturbingly efficient. This is not simply a story of one king's cruelty, but a blueprint for how absolute power, racial arrogance, and economic greed can fuse into something monstrous. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Genocide does not always announce itself with declarations or gas chambers. Sometimes it hides behind paperwork, quotas, and the quiet normalization of death. And before we can understand how this machine of violence was built, we must first recognize that it did not begin in a vacuum. There was a thriving world in the Congo before Leopold arrived, and everything that followed would be built on its destruction. Long before European maps labeled the region a blank space, the Congo Basin was alive with kingdoms, cultures, and connections that had endured for centuries. The Kingdom of Congo governed coastal trade routes and diplomatic networks. The Kuba and Luba realms oversaw intricate systems of law, art, and succession, and countless smaller communities thrived along the river arteries that tied the region together. Rivers served as highways, canoes as caravans, and elders as custodians of memory. This was not an empty wilderness. It was a world with rhythm, hierarchy, and meaning. Daily life unfolded in patterns that made sense to the people living there. Families farmed cassava and plantains, fished the broad rivers, hunted in dense forests, and held communal ceremonies to honor ancestors and spirits believed to guide the living. Work was shared, harvests celebrated, and knowledge passed orally through stories and songs. Craftsmanship flourished in woodcarving, weaving, and metalwork, while spiritual life intertwined with governance, shaping social norms and communal obligations. Identity here was rooted not in borders, but in kinship and land. Of course, the region was not untouched by hardship. The East African slave trade, driven in part by Arab Swahili networks, created violence and displacement along certain routes. Conflicts between neighboring groups sometimes erupted over resources, captives, or power. Ivory trading brought both opportunity and exploitation. But even amid these pressures, societies maintained political systems that balanced authority, tradition, and survival. Their challenges were real, but they were not chaos. They were part of a living, evolving landscape. When Europeans later described Central Africa as primitive or disorganized, they erased the sophisticated realities of these communities. Many Europeans saw only what confirmed their prejudices: villages instead of cities, oral history instead of written records, communal land instead of private property. They mistook difference for absence. In doing so, they justified intervention as civilization, ignoring the fact that the Congo already possessed social structures, cultural depth, and economic networks shaped over generations. The arrival of foreign explorers would disrupt this balance. Treaties signed under coercion, trade routes redirected toward foreign markets, and the first glimmers of external control would begin to unsettle the region. But it is crucial to understand the starting point. The Congo was not a blank page for Europeans to write on. It was a world with its own logic, dignity, and history, a world soon to be swallowed by an empire built on lies. In Europe, far from the Congo's forests and rivers, a frustrated monarch stared at maps with a hunger that outgrew his tiny kingdom. King Leopold II of Belgium ruled a nation barely the size of Maryland, prosperous but politically modest, overshadowed by larger empires like Britain and France. He longed for grandeur, territory, prestige, and wealth that could elevate Belgium onto the world stage. Yet his own parliament repeatedly denied his colonial ambitions, refusing to spend Belgian resources on overseas ventures. Leopold was a king with a crown but no empire, and that humiliation gnawed at him. So he devised an extraordinary solution. If Belgium wouldn't build him an empire, he would build one himself. He began crafting a public persona of humanitarian concern, speaking passionately about ending slavery in Africa and bringing progress to dark lands. He formed organizations with benevolent names like the International African Association, presenting them as scientific or charitable missions. Behind closed doors, however, Leopold spoke in blunt terms about profit, resources, and the need to secure a colony that could enrich him personally. His philanthropy was a theater. His motives were economic. Into this plan walked Henry Morton Stanley, the ambitious explorer who had charted long stretches of the Congo River. Stanley's expeditions, often marked by violence and coercion, mapped the interior and made contact with dozens of communities unfamiliar with European intentions. Under Leopold's funding, Stanley began negotiating treaties, documents many Congolese leaders could not read or fully understand, claiming vast territories in exchange for vague promises of protection. These signatures became the legal scaffolding for a new kind of empire, one built not by conquest on battlefields, but by paperwork and manipulation. Leopold sold his vision brilliantly. He told European leaders he wanted to create a neutral free trade zone that would uplift Africans and curb the slave trade. He framed his project as moral duty rather than imperial ambition, appealing to the era's obsession with civilizing missions. Newspapers praised him, diplomats applauded him, and philanthropists endorsed him. Few questioned what power a single monarch would wield over a land he owned privately. By the early 1880s, Leopold's strategy was taking shape. He had the explorer, the treaties, the organizations, and a persuasive humanitarian mask. All he lacked was international recognition, and with it, the legal right to rule a territory that was not his. That final step would not be decided in Africa, but in a meeting room in Berlin, where Europe would redraw an entire continent without ever asking the people who lived on it. In late 1884, diplomats, generals, and businessmen gathered in Berlin to decide the fate of a continent most of them had never seen. They sat around polished tables, quills poised, maps spread out like puzzles waiting to be claimed. No African leaders were invited, consulted, or even acknowledged. The conference was less a negotiation and more an auction, with European powers carving Africa into zones of influence, each guided by ambition rather than geography, culture, or humanity. The Congo Basin, home to millions, became a bargaining chip in a political game. Leopold arrived not as a conqueror, but as a master strategist. He presented himself as the only European leader without territorial greed, insisting he wanted a neutral African state devoted to science, free trade, and humanitarian progress. His front organizations, like the International African Association, served as evidence of his supposed noble intentions. Delegates, eager to avoid conflict among major empires, found comfort in Leopold's proposal. A philanthropic project seemed safer than letting France or Britain dominate the region. Through careful lobbying and relentless charm, Leopold achieved what no private individual had ever accomplished. The conference recognized the Congo Free State as his personal domain. It was not Belgium's colony, not a shared protectorate, but the private property of one man. On paper, treaties guaranteed free trade, protection of native populations, and religious freedom. In practice, these promises functioned as a moral shield, concealing the immense power Leopold now held. With a stroke of a pen, he gained sovereignty over territory larger than Western Europe. The irony was staggering. Documents filled with language about civilization and uplift were used to authorize absolute control. The world applauded Leopold's supposed humanitarian ambition, congratulating him for taking responsibility for a region portrayed as chaotic and in need of guidance. Newspapers praised the achievement, European leaders hailed him as a visionary, and few questioned how a single monarch could govern such a vast land ethically or effectively. The legal fiction was complete. As the conference ended, Europe celebrated a diplomatic success that avoided war between empires. But in the Congo, people continued planting crops, fishing rivers, and raising families, unaware that foreign pens in a distant city had claimed their homeland. They did not know that their land had been transferred like property, their futures rewritten without their consent. The Berlin Conference had drawn lines on a map, and those lines would soon harden into chains. When Leopold emerged from Berlin with legal ownership of the Congo, he wasted no time turning theory into control. His first move was deceptively simple. He declared that all land not visibly cultivated belonged to the state. To Europeans, it sounded bureaucratic. To Congolese communities, it was catastrophic. Most people lived through shared access to forests, rivers, and hunting grounds, spaces not fenced or farmed in European ways. With one decree, Leopold erased indigenous land rights and claimed millions of hectares as his personal resource bank. But a king alone could not squeeze profit from such vast territory, so Leopold devised a system of concession companies, private corporations like Abier and the Société Anversoise. He granted them enormous tracts of land in exchange for a share of their profits. These companies operated like feudal lords with corporate mandates, driven not by governance, but by extraction. Their success depended entirely on how much rubber and ivory they could force out of the land, and they turned quotas into law. In this world, failure was treated as rebellion, and rebellion as justification for violence. To enforce this system, Leopold created the Force Publique, a hybrid army and police force unlike anything in Africa at the time. European officers led ranks of African soldiers, some recruited with promises, many conscripted by force, others taken as children and trained under brutal discipline. Their mission was explicit: compel labor, crush resistance, and secure Leopold's profits. Armed with rifles and backed by authority, they became the spine of a violent hierarchy where fear functioned as policy, not punishment. The tools of coercion were as calculated as they were cruel. The shakot, a whip made from hippopotamus hide, delivered lacerations that scarred bodies for life, and sometimes killed. Hostage-taking became routine, with women and children seized until men returned with rubber or ivory. Villages that resisted were burned, livestock seized, leaders executed. Violence was not random, it was administrative. Each act was designed to turn human beings into labor units, to force productivity in a system where humanity held no value. By the late 1880s, Leopold's empire was fully operational. Bureaucrats drafted quotas, armed officers enforced them, companies tallied profits, and reports flowed back to Brussels describing a thriving project. On paper, everything looked orderly, efficient, even admirable. But beneath those numbers lay a machine powered by suffering, an entire country held hostage to a king's hunger for wealth. The Congo Free State had become what Leopold intended, a private empire, sealed off from international scrutiny, where every tree, every river, and every life could be monetized. For ordinary Congolese families, the transformation was immediate and brutal. What had once been seasonal work tied to farming, hunting, and communal rhythms became a near-permanent state of forced labor. Men were no longer tending fields or fishing rivers. They were disappearing into the forest for weeks at a time, scraping wild rubber from tangled vines until their hands blistered and bled. The labor was not a choice, nor even a duty to a distant ruler. It was a tax paid in sweat, pain, and fear, enforced at gunpoint by the force publique. As men were driven into the forests, women bore a different burden. They were ordered to supply food to outposts, carry loads for soldiers, or serve as hostages to ensure rubber quotas were met. Children became porters, hauling supplies across rugged terrain, sometimes collapsing from exhaustion along the trails. The daily structure of life, planting seasons, harvest festivals, family gatherings, collapsed under the weight of constant demands. Entire villages operated on the schedule of their overseers, not the rhythms of the land. When labor swallowed every waking hour, agriculture suffered. Fields went untended, crops rotted. Hunger spread through communities that had once been self-sustaining, turning homes into places of famine and fear. Families weakened not only from toil, but from the absence of fathers and sons whose return was never guaranteed. Malnutrition opened the door to disease, and villages that had thrived for generations now faced decline. The devastation was slow, steady, and devastating, an erosion of life disguised as economic policy. Some villages tried to hide when rumors spread that the force publique was approaching, fleeing into dense forests or swamps in hopes of avoiding the quotas. Chiefs found themselves trapped between impossible choices: cooperate with colonial demands to protect their people from immediate violence, or resist and risk destruction. A chief might hand over rubber to save a village one week, only to see soldiers return the next with higher quotas and harsher threats. There was no negotiating with a system that viewed humans as numbers on a ledger. In this new reality, fear was ever present. The crack of a shikot could silence a crowd. A patrol's arrival could empty a village within minutes. Families whispered stories of neighbors who vanished, of children taken as hostages, of men who returned from the forest with scars that never healed. Violence became a language spoken fluently by those in power, and survival became an act of endurance rather than freedom. Under Leopold's rule, life in the Congo did not simply become harder, it became a daily confrontation with a system designed to break the human spirit. In the 1890s, rubber became the miracle material of the industrial age. Bicycles rolled through European streets, telegraph wires spanned continents, and soon automobiles would redefine transportation. Factories clamored for latex, and prices soared like never before. In boardrooms from London to Paris, investors spoke of rubber as the future: flexible, durable, profitable. And far from these bustling cities, in the tangled vines of the Congo basin, Leopold saw an opportunity that could turn his private colony into a gold mine. Congo's wild rubber was difficult to harvest, but astonishingly lucrative. Unlike plantation rubber in Asia, these vines grew untamed, requiring immense labor to locate and tap. Leopold and his concession companies responded not by changing the land, but by intensifying demands on the people. Quotas surged to impossible heights. Villages that once delivered small amounts of rubber were now expected to produce staggering quantities. Failure was not treated as misfortune. It was labeled disobedience, punished as if it were rebellion. As profits soared, so did the brutality. Local agents and company officials were rewarded based on output, creating a system where violence directly translated into personal gain. The more rubber extracted, the richer the companies became, and the more brutal their enforcement grew. Soldiers of the force publique patrolled forests and rivers, driving laborers deeper into the wilderness. Some men tied rubber-soaked vines to their bodies to squeeze out every last drop, knowing that falling short could mean beatings, hostage-taking, or death. They worked not for wages, but to avoid punishment. Meanwhile, in Brussels, Leopold's wealth ballooned. He poured rubber profits into monumental projects, grand boulevards, lavish buildings, and royal estates designed to display Belgium's newfound prestige. European newspapers celebrated the transformation, marveling at the king's achievements while never asking where the money came from. Rarely did anyone connect the polished marble of Brussels to the bleeding hands of Congolese harvesters. The suffering was distant, the profits close, and silence was easy. In the Congo, the boom felt like a tightening noose. The forests that had once been sources of sustenance became sites of terror. Families watched their strongest members vanish into the wilderness for weeks at a time, returning gaunt and broken, or sometimes not returning at all. Villages emptied, not because of migration, but because the demands of rubber left no room for life. As wealth flooded Europe, the Congo bled, quietly, relentlessly, invisibly, fueling an empire built on pain. As rubber quotas climbed beyond human limits, violence stopped being a threat and became a system, cold, organized, and relentlessly enforced. When a village failed to meet its quota, the force publique arrived not to negotiate, but to punish. Soldiers marched in with rifles and torches, seizing food, burning homes, and dragging hostages away. Women and children were the most valuable captives, held in chains or locked in makeshift barracks until the men returned with rubber. Hostages were no longer exceptions. They were policy, a weapon designed to break communities from the inside. Punitive expeditions became routine. Entire villages were accused of rebellion simply for exhaustion or scarcity. Troops stormed through, shooting indiscriminately, setting fire to huts, and leaving behind smoldering ruins where families once lived. Men who tried to flee into the forest were hunted down. Elders who pleaded for mercy were beaten or killed. The shikot cracked across backs until flesh split open, its lashes tearing grooves into skin that sometimes proved fatal. Under Leopold's rule, punishment was not random cruelty. It was a calculated tool to enforce productivity. Then came the most haunting symbol of the regime, the severed hand. Soldiers were required to account for every bullet they fired, to prove ammunition wasn't wasted on hunting or personal revenge. The result was a grotesque system in which hands were collected as evidence, cut from corpses, and in some cases from the living, to show that bullets had been used correctly. Baskets of hands were presented like receipts, a grim ledger to satisfy officers and company agents. In some districts, hands took on a value of their own, traded or demanded to meet expectations when rubber could not. Violence had become mathematics. Missionaries and travelers later described scenes almost too harrowing to believe. Piles of severed hands, soldiers marching with strings of them, children missing limbs, villages where every man bore scars. Survivors spoke of nights lit by burning homes and mornings marked by silence, with families searching for the dead or mutilated. What made the terror even more chilling was its bureaucracy. Reports recorded quotas, punishments, and corrective measures with clinical detachment, as if human suffering were just another column in an account book. In this world, brutality was not a sign of chaos, it was order. Every beating, every hostage, every mutilation served the same purpose: to turn labor into obedience and fear into profit. The Congo Free State operated like a perfect machine of exploitation, grinding down lives in service of a king who would never witness the horrors committed in his name. And while the forests echoed with screams, Europe remained largely unaware or unwilling to care that a war of terror was being waged in the heart of Africa. When the worst of the terror finally drew global attention, one question loomed like a shadow over the Congo. How many lives had been lost? The truth was devastatingly hard to measure. Before Leopold's rule, there was no comprehensive census, no colonial records tracking population, no administrative system counting births or deaths. Communities measured life in stories, lineage, and memory, not in ledgers. By the time outsiders tried to calculate the damage, entire villages had vanished, and whole regions were empty where people once lived. The silence itself became evidence. Modern estimates vary widely. Some scholars argue the population dropped by at least 1 to 2 million, while others suggest losses as high as 10 million, roughly half the population. Even conservative figures reveal a demographic collapse on a scale that rivals the greatest atrocities of the modern era. The debate is not about whether millions died, but how many millions. The absence of precise numbers is not a sign of exaggeration. It is the result of destruction so thorough that records, witnesses, and entire bloodlines disappeared without trace. Death in the Congo did not always come at the muzzle of a rifle. Many died from punitive killings, as the force publique executed villagers accused of resisting or failing quotas. Others starved as fields went untended, livestock was seized, and families were torn apart by forced labor. Forced marches, portage work, and endless rubber harvesting drained bodies until they collapsed. Disease, especially sleeping sickness and smallpox, spread through weakened communities already ravaged by hunger and displacement. Even those who survived the lash often succumbed to illness born of exhaustion and fear. Perhaps the most chilling toll was one that rarely appears in statistics: the collapse of birth rates. Families separated by forced labor could not sustain normal life. Women held as hostages could not raise children. Trauma, flight, and famine shattered communities, and in many regions, fewer children were born than ever before. A generation disappeared not only through death, but through silence, future lives that never began. It was a slow erasure, as devastating as bullets or whips. Historians and legal scholars often turn to a word coined decades later: genocide. Though Leopold issued no formal order for extermination, the system he built produced destruction on a massive targeted scale. It was a regime driven by racial ideology, economic greed, and total disregard for African life. The goal was not to wipe out a people for its own sake, but to extract wealth at any human cost, and that cost was millions of lives. For many scholars, the Congo under Leopold stands as a clear example of colonial genocide, one that prefigured the mechanized atrocities of the 20th century. In the end, the numbers will never be fully known. The Congo's dead left behind few graves, fewer records, and almost no monuments. Their absence is their testimony: a population drained, a continent scarred, and a silence so vast that even today, the full magnitude of the tragedy can only be glimpsed through what is missing. In a land once filled with bustling villages and thriving kingdoms, emptiness became the final measure of loss. Even in the darkest years of Leopold's rule, the Congo was never a land of silent victims. Everywhere the regime imposed quotas and terror, resistance flickered to life, sometimes openly, sometimes in shadows. Villagers fled into dense forests or swamps to escape rubber demands, abandoning fields and homes rather than submit. Families hid tools, sabotaged equipment, and passed secret warnings along river routes when the force publique was near. Flight itself became a form of rebellion, denying the system the labor it depended on. In some regions, resistance took the shape of armed revolt. Communities attacked outposts, ambushed patrols, and killed company agents who pushed them beyond endurance. Entire districts erupted into localized wars as groups fought to reclaim territory or defend their people. These uprisings were often brief and costly, but they revealed a persistent truth. Congolese communities did not accept Leopold's rule as fate. They fought with whatever weapons they had: spears, traps, stolen rifles, and relied on intimate knowledge of the land to strike where soldiers were weakest. Not all violence flowed from the force publique alone. Leopold's system created layers of coercion and complicity, pulling some Africans into positions of power over others. Certain chiefs, desperate to shield their own communities, cooperated with the regime, providing labor or enforcing quotas to avoid worse reprisals. Others joined the force publique or worked for concession companies, becoming enforcers in exchange for protection, weapons, or survival. The most infamous were groups like the Zapo Zaps, who acted as feared auxiliaries, raiding villages, and delivering rubber and captives to colonial authorities. Morality blurred in a world where choices were shaped by terror. Yet resistance was not only physical, it was cultural and spiritual. Communities preserved their traditions in secret ceremonies, whispered prayers, and songs that carried memories of ancestors and freedom. Elders taught children stories that rooted them in identity despite displacement. Some villages planted hidden fields deep in the forest, cultivating food away from colonial eyes. Others maintained underground networks to shelter fugitives or reunite separated families. These acts, though small in scale, protected dignity in a system designed to erase it. Survival itself became a strategy. Families adapted by moving constantly, changing trade routes, or forming alliances with neighboring groups. Some negotiated temporary truces with local officers, buying time through tribute or misdirection. Others relied on scouts stationed along riverbanks to track patrol movements. The Congo did not simply endure passively. It bent, adapted, and resisted, refusing to collapse entirely beneath the weight of oppression. Through all of this, one truth remained constant. The Congo Free State was not a stable empire, but a territory held together by force against a population that never accepted its legitimacy. Every burned village, every ambush, every act of sabotage revealed cracks in Leopold's machinery of exploitation. Resistance did not overthrow the regime, but it kept its cruelty from ever being complete, and it set the stage for the world to finally take notice. For years, the Congo's suffering remained hidden behind distance, silence, and Leopold's impeccable public image. Reports flowing into Europe were carefully curated, filled with glowing language about progress, trade, and the civilizing mission. But truth has a way of slipping through cracks, and eventually, voices began to emerge. Voices that refused to be ignored. The first and most groundbreaking belonged to George Washington Williams, an African-American scholar, soldier, and journalist who traveled to the Congo in 1890. What he saw shattered the myth of humanitarian rule. Upon returning, he wrote an explosive open letter accusing Leopold of crimes against humanity, one of the earliest uses of that phrase. He described forced labor, mutilations, and mass death, calling the Congo not a philanthropic project, but a misery and horror. His words marked the beginning of an international awakening. Missionaries soon became crucial witnesses. Living among Congolese communities, they saw firsthand the burned villages, starving families, and mutilated survivors. They recorded testimonies, drew sketches, and eventually took photographs that revealed horrors too stark to deny. Some risked their lives to smuggle letters past colonial censors, sending detailed accounts back to Europe and America. These were not sensational rumors. They were written by people who had watched the Chicot tear flesh, who had comforted children missing hands, who had buried the dead with their own hands. Their reports transformed abstract allegations into visceral evidence. As information spread, it reached the ears of diplomats and activists who refused to let it fade. In 1904, Roger Casement, a British consul, conducted a formal investigation. His official report described systemic atrocities, forced labor, and widespread depopulation. It left no room for Leopold's excuses. Casement's findings ignited outrage in Britain and Ireland, where pressure mounted for action. Around the same time, a shipping clerk named Edie Morel noticed something strange. Ships leaving Belgium for the Congo carried guns and chains, while returning ships carried rubber and ivory, but never wages. He realized the economy was built on slavery. Horrified, he launched one of the first major human rights movements in history, the Congo Reform Association, mobilizing activists, churches, and journalists around the world. Public culture joined the fight. Writers like Mark Twain wielded satire as a weapon, mocking Leopold's supposed philanthropy and exposing his greed to mass audiences. Pamphlets, lectures, political cartoons, and rallies turned the Congo into a global cause. For the first time, millions of people across Europe and America were confronted with a colonial atrocity not as rumor, but as documented fact. The Congo was no longer a distant wilderness. It was a scandal. These witnesses did more than testify. They broke the silence that had enabled Leopold's empire. They transformed whispered stories into newspaper headlines, private pain into public outrage. Their voices pierced the facade of humanitarianism and forced the world to look squarely at what had been hidden in the shadows. The machinery of violence had been built in secrecy, but its downfall would begin with exposure. And as the pressure mounted, Leopold II found himself cornered, not by armies, but by the truth. As testimony and evidence spread across Europe and America, the polished veneer Leopold had crafted for decades began to crack. The king who once basked in praise as a humanitarian now found his name linked to torture, slavery, and mass death. But Leopold was not a man who surrendered easily. From his palace in Brussels, he launched a calculated counterattack, not against the atrocities themselves, but against the people exposing them. He hired public relations experts, funded sympathetic journalists, and commissioned glossy publications portraying the Congo as a land uplifted by his benevolence. The strategy was clear: muddy the truth, discredit critics, and protect the empire's profits. Leopold also created independent commissions designed to absolve him. Their members were handpicked, their access restricted, their findings sanitized. When confronted with photographic evidence of mutilated children or first-hand accounts of massacres, the king's agents dismissed them as exaggerations, fabrications, or misunderstandings of African customs. The goal was not to investigate wrongdoing, but to sow doubt. If the public could be convinced that abuses were isolated or accidental, Leopold's empire might survive the storm. For a time, the strategy worked. Some European elites clung to the belief that criticism stemmed from political rivalry rather than moral outrage. Meanwhile, Belgium itself was split. National pride urged many politicians to defend Leopold, fearing scandal would stain the country's image. Others were horrified by the mounting evidence and demanded accountability. Parliamentary debates grew tense as reformers pressed for oversight, while loyalists argued that the Congo was a source of national prestige and economic opportunity. Outside the chambers, citizens marched, clergy condemned the cruelty from pulpits, and newspapers printed harrowing testimonies. What had once been a distant rumor became a domestic crisis. The turning point arrived with the 1904-1905 investigations, culminating in a Belgian commission that, unlike Leopold's staged inquiries, exposed the reality. Witnesses described forced labor, hostage-taking, and mutilations. Statistics revealed catastrophic population loss. The findings confirmed what whistleblowers had been saying for years. The Congo Free State was a system of exploitation sustained by terror. Leopold's carefully woven narrative collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. Yet even as the world condemned him, Leopold continued spending Congo profits on opulent projects, grand monuments, palaces, and vanity constructions that transformed Brussels into a showcase of wealth. Tourists admired boulevards paved with Congolese suffering, unaware that every brick was paid for in blood. The contrast was grotesque. In Europe, marble and glass. In Congo, starvation and ruin. It became impossible to ignore the moral chasm between Leopold's public image and the reality of his rule. By the time international pressure reached its peak, Leopold was cornered. The facade had shattered, the world was watching, and his private empire stood on the brink of collapse. The question was no longer whether the Congo Free State would end, but what would replace it, and whether justice would ever reach the man who built an empire on human misery. When the scandal could no longer be contained, Leopold made a final move, not out of remorse, but strategy. Under mounting international pressure and domestic outrage, he agreed to surrender his personal control of the Congo. In 1908, the Congo Free State was officially annexed by Belgium and renamed the Belgian Congo. Newspapers hailed it as a new beginning, a turning point that would end abuses and bring genuine governance. Politicians framed the handover as a moral rescue mission, suggesting that the atrocities were the result of mismanagement rather than design. But behind the ceremonial language, the truth was far more complicated. On paper, reforms arrived. The concession system that had empowered private companies was scaled back. Forced labor was restricted by new regulations. Belgian administrators replaced many of Leopold's corporate agents. A formal colonial government was established, complete with bureaucracies, courts, and oversight mechanisms that promised order and protection. To the outside world, it appeared as though a nightmare had ended and civilization had prevailed. Belgium positioned itself as the benevolent successor, determined to develop the Congo responsibly. Yet in practice, many of the old patterns persisted. The economy still revolved around extraction, rubber, ivory, minerals, funneled toward European markets. Labor demands continued under different names, with taxes and quotas compelling Congolese workers into mines, plantations, and construction projects. Racism and paternalism shaped every interaction, enforcing a hierarchy in which African lives remained subordinate and voiceless. The new colonial administration may have been more organized, but it still treated the Congo as a resource, not a society. Exploitation shifted from private ownership to state management. The machine changed operators, not purpose. Meanwhile, Leopold himself escaped accountability. He died in 1909, wealthy, celebrated, and surrounded by ceremony. Crowds lined the streets for his funeral, and European leaders offered condolences for the passing of a great monarch. He was never tried, never punished, never forced to confront the millions of lives destroyed under his rule. Statues of him rose in Belgian cities, cast in bronze and marble, honoring a legacy built on suffering. The victims of the Congo Free State were given no monuments, no graves, no public mourning. Their erasure was as silent as their deaths. For Congolese communities, the damage endured long after the flag changed. Populations had collapsed, families were shattered, and cultural knowledge had been disrupted by decades of displacement and trauma. Villages that once thrived stood empty. Generations had been lost, not only through death, but through the breakdown of traditions, languages, and social structures. The transformation of the Congo from Leopold's personal colony to a Belgian colony did not restore what was destroyed. It simply carried the shadows forward into a new century. The world congratulated itself for ending the Congo Free State, but the deeper truth remained. The system had not been dismantled, only rebranded. The wounds of Leopold's rule would continue to shape the land and its people for decades, leaving scars that no treaty, proclamation, or flag could erase. The question that lingered was not whether the past would be remembered, but how far its consequences would reach into the future. When Leopold's rule ended, the violence did not simply fade into history. It echoed forward, shaping the Congo's future in ways the world still wrestles with today. The population losses of 1885–1908 left entire regions depopulated, stripping communities of farmers, hunters, storytellers, and elders whose knowledge held societies together. Generations were broken, and with them, the continuity of culture, language, and memory. The Congo entered the 20th century weakened not only in numbers but in the invisible fabric that binds a people to their past. As Belgium expanded its colonial administration, the logic of extraction remained. Rubber plantations gave way to copper mines, uranium pits, and later coltan fields, resources that fueled global industry and warfare. The wealth beneath Congolese soil was immense, and once again, foreign interests circled like vultures. Roads, railways, and ports were built not for local prosperity, but to move resources outward. The Congolese were rarely workers by choice. They were laborers by necessity, taxed, coerced, or conscripted into systems that treated their land as an engine for someone else's progress. Exploitation evolved, but it never ended. Independence in 1960 brought hope, but also instability. A young nation scarred by decades of colonial rule struggled with fragile institutions, uneven development, and deep regional fractures. The same lands once stripped for rubber became battlegrounds for Cold War interests, proxy conflicts, and resource wars. Leaders like Mobutu Sese Seko rose to power, ruling with corruption and brutality, echoing the authoritarian patterns seeded during colonial rule. Violence, coups, and civil wars carried forward the legacy of external exploitation intertwined with internal turmoil. The past was not gone. It had simply changed uniforms. Meanwhile, the memory of Leopold's Congo became a battlefield of its own. In Belgium, statues of Leopold II stood in public squares, admired for their grandeur, rarely questioned for their origins. Only in recent decades have activists pushed to remove or contextualize them, demanding acknowledgement of the millions who suffered under his reign. Museums and schools have begun revisiting the past, but debates continue. Was it genocide? How should responsibility be understood? Who gets to tell this history? For many Congolese, the answer is simple. The scale of destruction speaks for itself. In the Congo, memory persists in quieter forms. Families pass down stories of ancestors who fled into forests, who survived forced labor, who disappeared during the rubber years. Oral histories, once suppressed by colonial policy, have resurfaced in songs, rituals, and community narratives that affirm identity against erasure. Scholars, activists, and artists reclaim what was stolen, voices silenced by whips and quotas now rising to demand recognition. The struggle is not merely to remember, but to restore dignity. Today, the Congo remains rich in resources: cobalt for batteries, coltan for smartphones, diamonds and minerals that power modern life. And yet, instability persists, often fueled by the same forces that once drove rubber extraction: foreign profit, political manipulation, and disregard for Congolese lives. The past lingers not as distant history, but as a warning written into the present. The scars left by Leopold's empire remind us that when greed meets unchecked power, human beings become expendable. The story of the Congo Free State is not simply a chapter in colonial history. It is a mirror held up to the world. It asks how far societies will go in the name of progress, how easily violence can be disguised as benevolence, and how long injustice can survive behind silence. Remembering the Congo is not an act of nostalgia, but of responsibility. It forces us to confront the cost of forgetting and the danger of repeating patterns when profit outweighs humanity. In the end, the Congo's story teaches a stark truth. The past is never truly past. Its shadows stretch across generations, shaping nations, haunting memory, and challenging us to reckon with what power can destroy and what remembrance might preserve.